Hi. A few weeks ago, I posted a video about how you in general, but especially you if you are involved in Christian ministry or moving your way toward Christian ministry, should read as widely as you can. All kinds of books and watch a variety of movies, read a lot of literature and all the rest. Because what I have found and what I suggested to you all is that sometimes the very best insights you can get on a topic are ones that kind of don't look directly at the topic, but catch it, as it were, out of the corner of its eye. Today I want to talk a little bit about how important it is to read people with whom you know you disagree. I want to share kind of two brief stories about why reading people you know you disagree with is very important to me. One of my favorite philosophers of science is a guy named Paul Feyerabend, and he's kind of a controversial figure. But what I noticed early on is that he, in his second book, he dedicated part of that book to explaining and responding to some of his critics of the first book. And one of the things he said all the time was that they must not have read his book. And so he was responding saying, I can't believe you would review the book so negatively if you hadn't even read it. And at first I thought, well, that kind of comes off as harsh. Well, then I remember I read somebody who was critical of Feyerabend, and my impression as I read that was, that's not what he says. He doesn't make that argument. And what I realized is Feyerabend was trying to be charitable, because the argument seems to be either they couldn't read, or they read it but can't follow an argument, or else maybe they didn't read the book. And that's the most charitable response. He was so fundamentally misrepresented, and often is, that if somebody tells me, something that they think about Paul Feyerabend, I am immediately going to wonder, is this based on actual knowledge, or is it based only on the caricature that you see in so many other writings? A second interesting story is that one of the only reviews that has been written of my published PhD thesis highlighted one particular part as being the most important contribution in the whole book. And I was struck by how funny that is to me personally, because it is a spot where I try to refute the criticisms of one particular critic of T.F. Torrance. And from my point of view, the only thing I did was I read carefully this critic, and I looked at what he said, I read his footnotes, I tried to trace down where he got his ideas from, and then I went back to T.F. Torrance and I looked at the places he was engaging with, and I pointed out that if he had read Torrance more carefully, he may not have made the same mistake that he had. And so to me, it seemed as though the argument he was making was based fundamentally on the fact that he had misunderstood. Perhaps he had already begun with an idea of what Torrance was saying, assumed all the rest of it, and then published this argument against it. So I think that especially if you disagree with someone, or at least you think you disagree with someone, it's important to actually read them, and to read them carefully. And I want to give you a few reasons as to why that's the case. The first reason why you should deliberately read people with whom you disagree is because the fact of the matter is you're going to read those people. You're going to read people with whom you disagree no matter what. There is no way you're going to read at all, ever, without having somebody present an idea with which you do not agree. And if you go into these things knowing, I may not agree with everything they say, I might have problems with it, you may avoid being sucked into a deceptively attractive view that you finally think is wrong. A second reason why you should deliberately read people with whom you disagree is because it's very important that if you're going to disagree with somebody, especially if any kind of public disagreement, you really should know what they say, why they say it, and not rely on any kind of caricatures, like I said before, that so often is the case with someone like Paul Feyerabend. You see, it's so easy, and the church gets more caught up in it than is good for it, to simply imagine that people understand what people who disagree with them might have to say, and then they go out in public and they try to argue against it, and to people on the outside it becomes clear that they may not actually know what they're talking about. Some of the hot button issues that go into play make it very clear that sometimes people argue they simply don't even know enough about what one another think to even know if they disagree. Now, I'm not saying that if you learn what someone you disagree with has to say and you take them seriously and you treat them fairly as far as handling their ideas fairly, I'm not saying that doing that will make you agree with them, but what I'm saying is until you've done that, until you've dug into it to the point where you really understand it from their own point of view, you're not even yet to the point where you know if you disagree with them or not. And so it's very difficult to speak publicly about something you disagree with if you don't even really know it. A little bit of an interesting story about that kind of thing is Richard Dawkins is an atheist philosopher and a biologist who has published widely about the non-existence of God and the danger of theism. And he was responded to by many people, but in particular by a theologian scientist named Alistair McGrath. And one of the things that McGrath points out is there's a massive oversight in Dawkins' work, and that is he simply has absolutely no knowledge, no exposure to the great tradition of the church and the larger Christian theological tradition. Now, someone might expect, when you pointed out that the very subject you're writing about, you know very little about, you might expect someone to go, oh, I should go back and do my homework. But Dawkins responded essentially by saying, I don't consider the study of God to be a real subject. I think it to be an empty subject. And for Professor McGrath to criticize me for my ignorance of Christian theology would be like if I were to criticize Professor McGrath for his ignorance of fairyology. But of course, there's a big difference between the two, because while Alistair McGrath is both a theologian and a trained scientist, and therefore knows what he's writing about in those things, Dawkins is not. But Dawkins has chosen to write about Christian theology and Christian views of God, whereas Alistair McGrath has not chosen to write about fairies. The proper treatment of a non-subject is to simply ignore it. If you're going to engage with it because you believe the view is hostile, you believe the view is difficult for humanity, or that causes problems, the proper thing to do is to actually understand it before you start publishing about it. There is too much in our world of treating the other side of an argument as if it's a straw man. And so what that basically means is we either simplify an opponent's view to the point where nobody really affirms it. It's the weakest possible expression of it. Or else what we do is we take and we try to present to an audience in an allegedly neutral way, and we line up all the best arguments and all the best reasons for our side and all the worst reasons for their side. And we have a word for that when we line those kinds of things up that way. It's called propaganda. So if we don't want to be propagandists, either wittingly or unwittingly, we have got to make sure that if we're going to disagree publicly with a viewpoint, we need to actually know what we're talking about. In order to do that, we have to actually read them and take it seriously. Related to that point is this idea that in order to understand fully and adequately a current view, a current idea that you disagree with, it might be very possible that you need to go back a bit and try to understand where those views came from. In order to understand a current view you don't like, you may have to go back and really dig into another view, an older view that you don't like. I know that there are certain things that are said by some of my clergy colleagues as well as lay people in the church that I would not begin to understand if I didn't have a working knowledge of philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and if I didn't understand theologians at least a little bit like Friedrich Schleiermacher. It can also be really important to kind of dig into those source materials because it might help to understand why certain people are convinced by views that you think don't have much merit to them. My secondary field, as I've mentioned already, is philosophy of science, and by far the most popular view of how science operates, the most popular philosophy of science in our society today is one that is, if not the same as, certainly largely influenced by that of a man named Karl Popper. And Karl Popper wrote a book where basically his whole philosophy of science is that we create theories in our science to try to deal with the data the best that we can. And then the important part is we then go about our business to try to actively falsify them. We try to find examples in nature. We try to find evidence that goes against it, because what that will do is it will falsify the theory that we have, and it will force us to go back to the drawing board and come up with a better solution. And one of the things that I have found when I've read him, especially Conjectures and Refutations, is that his perspective is so winsome. It's so attractive. I want it to be true. There's something about you inside that says, yes, this is the way it's supposed to be. This is the only honest way to proceed. That if I didn't already know the significant historical and philosophical problems with this view, I'd be convinced by it. And so reading someone like Karl Popper helps me to understand when I meet somebody who has essentially bought this whole position, it doesn't seem to see any of the weaknesses in it, I have to understand this is a very attractive view. It's something that is very almost beguiling when you see it in the bigger picture of things. It's so attractive that it's almost a miracle that anybody was able to see past it and see what the problems were. A third reason why you should read people with whom you know you disagree, and I think this is a big reason why people don't like to do it, is because you may find out that they're right. Maybe not in whole. Maybe the person who you disagree with is actually, in the big picture, still wrong, but you may find in the midst of their discussion, you may find little bits and pieces where they make good arguments, where you need to pay attention and say, I hadn't seen it that way before, and it may shed new light on what you're thinking. Now, again, I'm not saying that if you understand them correctly, you will necessarily be converted to their position, but what I'm saying is you may find that someone with whom you disagree may say some pretty intelligent things, may say some pretty stimulating things, and once you do that, it, one, helps you do your job better, it helps you, two, to treat them more authentically and more fairly, and three, it helps you to treat them as an intelligent human being made in the image of God just like you. It's kind of an example of that. There's another philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, who goes to great lengths. He spends like 90 pages in this article trying to defend what he at least believes are the implications of Karl Popper's system. And one of the things I love about that and a handful of other papers is that they are so honest. They're trying so hard to be upfront and totally rigorous about all their assumptions and all the rest. And in doing so, they simply, in my judgment, fail to actually create a sympathetic and winning argument. And what I find when I read people like that is I find that their points are oftentimes valid, and they're really trying to marshal these points to this larger issue. But what I find is that it's actually not, in spite of the fact that their other points are valid, that makes their larger point wrong. It's actually because of it, and that in my judgment they fail to see how those points that they worked so hard and have been so rigorously honest about don't lead in the direction that they thought, that I find very illuminating and helpful when I'm sorting through my own thinking. So in the end, it's very important that we spend time reading people with whom we know we disagree. It may not always be fun. It may not always feel productive. It might be that, at least in some of us, it might actually get us more ready to kind of pick a fight with someone. And if that's the case, we need to watch out. But at the very end of the day, it's really the very least that we can do to kind of do our homework and to be able to be as charitable and as full of intellectual virtue and responsibility as we possibly can. Well, that's all that I have for this week. If you have any questions you'd like me to take up or discuss, please send me an email at pastorstevik@gmail.com. Please consider liking and sharing this on Facebook. You can also consider subscribing to the channel that these are posted at. I also post some other things as well, but it's youtube.com/tstevik1. I'll see you next time.